Okay, if we could resume the hearing sessions now. So we're just wrapping up on matter one. So those outstanding questions on the habitats regulation assessment. So I think we got to the point on the mitigation measures, didn't we, Ms. Butler, in terms of how permanent they are? Will they be in place over the plan period? And has any thought been given to any need to increase resources of those measures as a result of projected housing growth in the borough? So if you're in a position to answer that now, Ms. Butler.
Thank you, inspectors. Just to, and apologies for earlier, just to recap, Merton's habitat regulations assessment is document OD12 as submitted to the last December, and it's supplemented by LBM08, which is the updated version that looks at the modifications. Focusing on OD12, section 4 looks at the measures that are intended to avoid or reduce harmful effects. And the next section, section 5, looks at the in-combination effects. Section 4 outlines these matters. These include matters to deal with recreation and urbanization. So things like visitor and recreational pressure, increased predation by cats and dogs, increased fly tipping, air pollution, and matters like that, non-physical disturbance such as noise, vibration, and light. Section 4, Section 5, and Figure 13 outline that there are no allocated housing sites within 200 meters of the European sites. On the issue of whether the mitigation measures are permanent, yes, they generally are. Many of them are matters like bylaws, and there's no indication that those would change during the lifetime of the plan. One point to note is on site WI3. On document OD12, page 58, figure 13 sets out the assessment of site allocations. And for site WI3, the recommendation in the HRA is that applicants contact Natural England to ensure that their proposal, let me just bring that up, that their proposal can seek advice and engage with Natural England because of the travel implications. Now, the allocation of site WI3 has a strong emphasis on public transport rather than private car parking, but there is still recognition that site WI3's proximity to the European sites may necessitate contact with Natural England in this regard. It's true that that is not included in the site allocation, and it may be worth us considering whether contacting Natural England should be part of the site allocation WI3 to ensure any issue of travel and any mitigation in that regard is funded specifically for that site proposal relevant to habitats regulations.
Thanks, Ms. Butler. So we've got that on the radar now then for site allocation WI3, but we'll pick it up in our general discussions when we come to discuss that site in more detail next week as well. So paragraph 4.11 of the Habitats Regulation Assessment. So that's OD. Sorry, remind me of the reference, Ms. Butler.
Reference OD12.
D12, yeah. So paragraph 4.11, it talks about there are mitigations measures such as legislative that can be implemented by the council and other statutory bodies. So what is that picking out here? Because you've said there's legislative measures already in place, such as bylaws. But is that anticipating some other measures might be implemented, or is it just noting that there is a potential to do it?
Paragraph 4.10, just above, talks about, and this heading is under visitor and recreational pressure. It refers to bylaws such as dog control orders and those kind of matters.
Yeah, so the wording's perhaps a bit unclear there, because those provisions are already in place. They're not something that can be implemented in theory, either they have been implemented. Is my understanding of that correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Butler. That concludes our questions on matter one. Mr. Burton, anything finally on matter one? Okay, thank you. So that finishes our session on matter one, and we now move on to matter two.
Okay. So we now move on to discuss whether the plan is consistent with national policy in terms of its plan period and identification of strategic policies, and whether the document serves a clear purpose in a succinct, clearly written and unambiguous way. Just by way of an introduction to this topic, I'd like to invite the council to outline in broad terms their view on this matter, please. Ms. Butler.
Yes, we believe the plan is consistent with national policy, and in its identification of strategic policies, this is when considering the submitted local plan in combination with the main modifications set out in LBMO 03. Which address, as set out in our statement, which addresses some of the issues raised, such as clearly identifying which policies are strategic.
Just on that point, Ms. Butler, dealing with that middle bit first, if you like. The council's obviously proposing MM 11.1, and it's for that purpose, isn't it, to clarify which of its policies are strategic?
Yes.
Mr. Butler, do you have any, my apologies, Mr. Burton, do you have any comments to make on that particular point?
We haven't reviewed the choice of what is strategic and what isn't strategic. It's welcome that there is a beginning of a clarity around that point, but inevitably there's a judgment to be made as to what qualifies. There are some strategic issues we think are missing, but that's a separate issue, I think, for you.
It is. Okay, we'll kind of come back onto some associated issues. Okay, so Ms. Butler, moving on to the plan period. Your hearing statement states adoption will have to take place from 2022-23 and not 21-22, and there's an alternative start date for the plan period proposed, and I think you've done that in MM 1.1. Can you just explain, for the purpose of the hearing, what's the basis for that view, and why not leave the start date where it is and simply extend the plan period?
the plan periods, in accordance with the MPPF paragraphs 22, says that the plan period should cover a period of 15 years from adoption. Although the plan was submitted to the Secretary of State in December 21, so years 21, 22, it wasn't and couldn't now be adopted last year. And therefore, the modification proposed to take the plan from 22, 23 to 36, 37, which is 15 years. This also chimes with the London plan's adoption in March 2021. So just inside a month in the years 21, 22. The London plan is part of Merton's development plan and sets many of the strategic policies, such as the housing target.
So I'll come back to you in a moment, Spoon. So if the start of the plan period were to be in 2022-23, as proposed, have you considered the implications of the DLUC correspondence dated the 8th of April 2022, and in particular the HDT rulebook? And just to confirm, at paragraph 17, that states, for the purposes of calculating the housing delivery test, the new adopted housing requirement will apply from the start of the relevant plan period set out in the strategic policies for housing, which may be earlier than the adoption of the strategic policies. Might this be of any significance to the start of the plan period and the proposed housing trajectory and the implications for future HDT results and 5-year supply issues? I know there's quite a lot in there.
The London plan, which sets the strategic housing target for all boroughs, was published on the 1st of March 2021. So just inside a month inside the last elements of 21-22. The housing requirements within it date from 2019, the 10-year housing requirements in the London plan date from 2019 to 2029, picking up on the information you just mentioned, Mr. Aston, about from the Secretary of State. As I understand your question, you're asking whether or not the council's strategic target should start earlier than 22-23 in recognition that the London plan target started strategically in 2019.
Yeah, I think the point is, Ms. Butler, that looking at paragraph 22 as well of the framework which you referred us to, so that says strategic policies should look ahead over a minimum 15-year period from adoption. It doesn't indicate that the plan period should start at adoption, and indeed a lot of plans have plan periods that start before adoption. And thinking in terms of what the implications might be, we're going to move on to in more detail the discussion of the housing delivery tests. But in terms of what the implications might be once the plan's adopted, I'm just sort of thinking out loud here, but you might have a year of the unmitigated London plan figure, which is the adopted housing figure, and then 2 of the adopted requirement figures in your local plan, and what that might do in terms of housing delivery tests in future years. And as it's a main modification to alter the plan period, the submitted plan starts when it does. You don't. I'm not persuaded of the necessity to move the start of the plan period onwards. It's just a consideration of what effects that might have in housing supply terms, especially when you've got a newly adopted plan and the strategy in there, which we're going to talk more about in coming days. But I just wondered whether any of those, I'm rambling a bit, but I wondered whether any of those implications have been taken into account when you've looked at responding to that.
I think it's fair to say we need to consider them further at this point.
Mr. Burton, you have any comments on that?
Yeah, we've got three, I think, simple points to make on the plan period. We're not, as it were, dogmatic about what date is used to start the plan, but we are concerned that the period of the plan at least complies with government policy. Indeed, we'd like to see it longer. We think 15 years is a minimum, but that isn't required for compliance with the MPPF. So the 3 points are, first and most obvious one is we're in June 2022, so we're already into the 15-year period, and we're still some way away. So it's not a 15-year period from adoption, because it would have to be adopted before the end of March 2022 for that to be the case. The second is the history of optimism bias with the preparation of this local plan. I would remind you that the Council's Borough Plan Advisory Committee, that's the group of councillors who advises the team, in September 2018 was informed that the plan before us would be submitted in mid-2019 and adopted in 2020. So we are not entirely confident that this plan is going to be adopted soon, however efficient this process is. And then the third point is around if you keep sort of extending in an incremental way the period, at some point your evidence base starts to become out of date, your sustainability appraisal may not be robust, and we contest the conclusion that the council's reached that all of that covers any necessary extension to the period. It's a fast-moving world out there on issues like the climate, on air pollution and other questions, and we fear the plan may already be being overtaken by events, and some of its evidence base is already dated. If we simply keep moving it a year forward and don't actually look at some of the fundamental questions in light of that new evidence, we're going to not have a sound plan.
Thank you, inspectors. Yes, we too have flagged, I wouldn't say optimism bias, but just the issue of when hearings are finished and assuming our good fortune to have a positive result, the speed at which the council itself can engage to actually move through a committee cycle and adopt a plan is something we have flagged as a concern as well as this stage. I would point out that, yes, you're right, in September 2018, we were more confident that we would move swifter through the local plan process. But as it happened, we then took a subsequent decision to do further public consultation, which has moved the date, and we updated the local development scheme accordingly. Finally, we believe our evidence base is up to date. It was up to date when it was submitted in December last year. It remains up to date, and we don't anticipate that that is an issue.
What are the implications if a longer plan period should be required?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
Scrap that, Ms. Butler. Yeah, you will have seen, obviously, the rep from Mr. Burton refers to it being a 14, not a 15-year period from adoption. But what are the implications if a longer plan period should be required?
As set out in your response to matter 2, or is it? Much of the evidence base that we have where we work, especially with London. So, for example, the Strategic Housing Land Availability Assessment, and which sets the housing target, runs to 2041, which is from 2019, which is from 2017, which is far longer than a 15-year period would be, even from next year or the year after. We'd also point out that much of the strategic evidence base rests on that long forecasting period. The other issue is that local plans have to be reviewed every 5 years. So if there was, as Mr. Burton says, a change of evidence or some significant change, that would necessitate a review of Merton's policies and an update of the relevant policies and an update of the evidence base within the 15-year time table. So it's important to note that there's a level of resilience to take account of changing circumstances, and that applies to all local planning authorities.
Thank you. Just floating this point. Would a potential pause to the examination to produce any further evidence relating to 1 year at the end of the plan period be consistent with the achievement of up-to-date and genuinely plan-led approach, which is paragraph 15 of the framework? There's a potential for some reflections there on paragraph 68 of the framework and 68B, the relevance of at least 2 plan reviews before those latter years of the plan period. That's paragraph 33 and as required by Reg 10A of the 2012 regs. Do you have any particular kind of views on that, Ms. Butler?
For the efficiency of having an up-to-date local plan, which is a legal requirement for all local planning authorities, at this point, we would very much support a continuation of the local plan examination, particularly as the hearings are spread between June and October, which allows for time to prepare any evidence, if there is necessary evidence, to take the plan period either starting a year earlier or continuing to 2037, 2038. We don't believe that moving the plan period forward from the current proposal in our main modifications from 2036, 37 to 37, 38 would necessitate such evidence as to require a pause in the examination that we couldn't at least try to accommodate during the break between stage 1 hearings in June and stage 2 hearings in October, for the sake of 1 year.
Mr. Burton, any view on that? What you've heard?
Well, in our view, it's black and white that this is not a 15-year plan period. Therefore, if there is a modification to be made, we need to be confident that the plan remains robust in that extended period. It has been incrementally extended over a number of years, and I referenced the position in 2018. We're dealing with an evidence base that in some cases goes back to sort of 2008, 2010. At some point, the elastic has to snap. Obviously, we are not wanting to unnecessarily delay the production of the plan. We can see the real benefits of having a local plan that reflects more modern times than the current one. But it does seem to me wise that the preparatory work is put in place, that if we do need to extend it, that we're able to move quickly to appropriate modifications to the plan which will enable that to be effective.
Make any further comments, Ms. Butler, on that point?
Just one point, and I think we've learned this from the London plan. It makes, in our opinion, it makes the planning system a bit more opaque, trying to explain to people why, when a plan is adopted at a certain point, that it actually started several years before adoption. I think it's fair to say that myself and my colleagues struggle with that with the London plan, and trying to explain to someone who isn't involved in planning why a plan started 3 years before it was adopted it's just more difficult to understand. So while we will absolutely take on board the matters raised at this hearing, we also want to pick up on the point of making our plan understandable and straightforward as far as possible.
Yes, yeah, and I hear that point, Ms. Butler. I was thinking more in terms of plan-led, and these are things that we're going to explore, as I said, further over the course of the hearings. But in thinking about a plan-led approach to housing requirements and supply, and particularly given the situation that you're looking at a stepped requirement, and we have the added complication of the 20% buffer from the HDT. It's just a question of how the plan period could help you to have an effective plan in those respects. And I think I totally hear you in terms of it seems a bit counterintuitive to have a plan period that stretches before adoption. But as I've said, the framework doesn't anticipate that the plan period starts on adoption. It just says the policy should run 15 years from adoption. So in terms of an extension of the plan period, you've got the SHLA and the other employment evidence base that covers London, and it covers the period up to 2041. Is that correct? So in terms, and given what as Inspector Aston referred to, I think it's paragraph 68B of the framework, and that's talking specifically about housing. So it says planning policies should identify a supply of specific developable sites or broad locations for growth for years 6 to 10, and where possible for years 11, 15 of the plan. So that where possible, I think, is important there. It might not be possible to do it for year 15, but given that there's going to be 2 reviews at least before you get to that point, it's just a question of how proportionate that your evidence has to be on that point. So if we can leave you to reflect on the plan period in terms of the discussion we've had, so that'll be something that we'll be picking up. It'd be perhaps useful to see some further thinking on that by way of a topic paper, and perhaps that might also sort of influence whatever main modification then goes forward to that end. I think it'd be sensible if that's done post hearings rather than trying to get, given that we've got the stage 2 hearings in October. So does that all sound reasonable, Ms. Butler?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, just before we move away from that particular, just a question on infrastructure delivery plan. The Council's response to our first preliminary matters letter, which is document reference LBMR1, indicates that the infrastructure delivery plan is to be refreshed to address proposed alterations to the plan period and to reflect particularly infrastructure requirements relating to the first 5 years of the period following adoption. Can you just explain, Ms. Butler, for the purpose of the hearing, why this refresh is required at this stage, and when would we expect to see a finalised document available?
Merton's infrastructure delivery plan was document reference 14D4, which was submitted to the examination last December. 14 D4, and this is Merton's Infrastructure Delivery Plan 2021. As with other infrastructure matters, such as the annual infrastructure funding statement that the council produces relating to community infrastructure levy funding, we keep the infrastructure delivery plan as a live document to take into account any particular infrastructure funding changes. And that seems very pertinent here in 2022. We anticipate refreshing this document between the stage 1 and stage 2 hearings, and if the inspectors consider it necessary, can submit any changes from December 21 to about July 22.
Make any comments on that point at all?
Yeah, thanks, Ms. Butler. Yes, so that'd be useful if we have it in good time for the stage 2, because that's where we anticipated discussing infrastructure in much more detail anyway. Thank you.
Apologies, Mr. Will. I didn't realise you were asking me a question then. I think that's what Inspector Ford sent in. Right, okay. Right, okay. Moving on, just in terms of clear purpose. We've set out some initial findings in the MIQs and noted the initial response from the council. And the council are looking at ways these matters can be addressed. Can you update us on that work so far, please, Ms. Fuller?
Can I just confirm, Inspector, that this relates to your preliminary letter, the very first letter?
Yes, where we set out, was it the second where we set out? Sorry, it's the second letter, I think, where we set out some initial comments. And that elicited your response, which was, this isn't really an issue for us. We're working on it, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, so in short, Ms. Butler, it was those points that we made about the clarity of the plan as a whole, and you'd responded to us in your response to our second preliminary matters letter, but we nevertheless put something on the MIQs to elicit others' responses. But in terms of those general principles, I think we've touched on there. So in terms of the clarity, the succinctness, some of the formatting issues, could you update us on what you're thinking on how some of those things could be addressed?
Thank you, inspectors. Yes, in the council's response, which is LBM02, we've set out how we've already acted in some of these regards to address any drafting errors. We also point out in that response that the plan, partly necessitated by government's drive towards a digital plan making system, which is increasingly clear, and partly necessitated by the COVID-19 pandemic not really permitting normal paper distribution, is that we are laying out the plan to be digested more in a digital format. We will, should we successfully reach a stage where after stage 2, we are creating a plan incorporating supported main modifications, we will ensure that it is digestible not just in a digital format as laid out on the website chapter by chapter, but also making sure that there is an option for someone to print off a whole plan if necessary. The other issue we have been working on is the policies map. and ensuring it can be created in geographic information system methods so that people can zoom in online, unlike with the PDF versions. And we hope that that will help people to navigate the geography of the plan as well. However, this wouldn't be finalized until the points moving more towards adoption to avoid any confusion with the council's existing adopted local plan.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Burton, obviously, just hearing what Ms. Butler said, paragraph 5 of your statement refers to a long-standing lack of clarity. You know, you've acknowledged response has and is being made, but you still consider the response to be inadequate. That's correct, isn't it? Just pause there for a moment.
That is correct.
I'll carry on. For the purpose of the hearing, I'd like you to elaborate on those concerns, please. You know, are these simply matters of proofreading, further clarification in modifications, main and additional? Obviously noting that the MMs would be subject to public consultation at the appropriate time, and there'll be an opportunity at stage 2 hearings as well, which might also offer the chance for further discussions. I'm interested in your view on the shortcomings and how they could be addressed, please.
Bit of a deep breath on this one. I mean, I think it is important to know where we've come from. And in the 2 years between 2019 and 2021, it felt like the kind of issues which I'll reflect on just weren't being addressed. So in 2021, despite having made these comments in 2019, we felt it necessary to feed in representations that the plan was riddled with errors, incorrect policy numbering and references, syntax errors, incomplete sentences, incorrect references to the MPPF and planning practice guidance, incorrect transposition of London plan policies and Transport for London decisions, factual errors, inconsistent and missing paragraph numbers, duplicate text, missing text, wrongly located text, a site allocated to the wrong area, omission of a nationally listed heritage asset, maps lacking both titles and identifying numbers, and incorrectly named locations in the borough. The plan in places was grammatically illiterate. The drafting of a number of the planning policies was unclear, and it was apparent that different parts of the plan had been drafted by different authors, which meant that the style was inconsistent, as was the approach. And as I mentioned earlier, those issues hampered the plan as a document, but they also hampered the willingness of people to engage because they weren't being changed. Now, we recognise that none of those comments are addressed in the main and the more minor modifications that the council have subsequently proposed. And where those changes have been made, we'd certainly support your acceptance of those. But despite you raising very early on concerns about the clarity and indeed the structure and the sort of intelligibility of the document, even within the documents that we have before us today, with those main modifications as proposed by the council, we still don't have a contents page. We still don't have a chapter 8. We seem to have 3 unrelated chapter 1s. It's still not possible to distinguish the policies effectively from the rest of the supportive text and to know where they start and end, despite the very familiar use of tinted boxes and different fonts by other local plans. The numbering and the identification of the policies is confusing. I found it quite difficult to work out what the latest version is, but I'd welcome clarification that the key diagram is going to be legible, that the map of the opportunity areas is accurate. The document is far from concise, running to more than 700 pages. Obviously depends on quite how that pagination is done and what track changes there are. It's still not possible to actually work out how many chapters there are in the document. It's still written by many hands. It still lacks an editorial style. It still lacks a clear narrative on what the plan's trying to achieve. And it's still based on an evidence base which feels dated in many places, which was unavailable to us during much of the plan preparation. where the evidence base is in place is contested. And we would particularly reference the open spaces study, the small sites toolkit, and the character study. And where the retail study is 2011, the town centre study is 2008, the parking survey is 2012, the employment land study is 2010, notwithstanding the fact that the GLA has got additional evidence, which is clearly helpful. And that's before we actually look at the drafting of the policies themselves and whether they work as effective and meaningful planning policies. But I might pause there before I get on to that point.
Carry on, Mr. Burton. You can carry on with it.
Well, an example. So, I mean, our understanding is the local plan is a document there to help determine planning applications. And that's the expectation of national policy, and the clarity and the definition is important. But if we look, for example, at what I think is now numbered N4.1 for Mitcham, leaving aside that we believe it's a village and not a town, I don't know where that policy starts. Does it start with an introduction which says that we're leading the way with providing award-winning sustainable forms of development? That feels like a PR and advocacy statement, not a statement for planning policy. And is it appropriate for planning policies to be talking about the fact we're going to be celebrating the unique character or championing sustainable design? They're not planning policies, they're statements of intent, and they won't help development management team facing planning applications. There isn't the precision in the drafting which is necessary, and that we see reflected in the challenges we face in implementing the current plan, which also lacks that precision, and in many cases doesn't seem to drive decisions that are being made to the point where we would expect it. But we would urge you, and that's just one example, to look at the actual practical effectiveness of the drafting across all the policies. We're just drawing attention to one of them.
Okay, thank you. I mean, obviously we'll discuss the policies in stage 2. That will come up then. And before I ask Ms. Butler if she's got any comments on that, can I ask you, Mr. Burton, how could your concerns be addressed?
It's difficult, and we acknowledge that. We've raised this throughout the process, and at an earlier stage, we asked the council to rewind the process to start from a better place. It hasn't done that, and the plan's sort of grown like Topsy, and it still has become more and more unwieldy. It's got chopped about, and it's become more remote from people, and that's really difficult. We also know that we want to have a local plan, and we don't want you, as it were, to recommend halting the process to address many of these issues. And we acknowledge that some of the detailed comments have belatedly been picked up. And what we'd ask you to do is continue the thrust of your interrogation of the plan on this issue. For example, let's have a contents page. Let's know what figures and maps and diagrams are within it. Let's have titles. Let's be able to navigate and signpost the plan, and anything you can do to support that. Let's improve the presentation of the policies and tighten up their wording, and that may require quite forensic modifications. There is an issue which we haven't really addressed here, but the structure, it feels awkward when we have the relationship between the sort of geographic policies to the areas like Mitcham and the thematic policies, when many of these thematic policies are quite site specific, and how we get that relationship working effectively is an issue that we've raised and which we hope you can help resolve. And we know that we will only get a moment's respite from this plan being completed before the next one starts. And anything you can do to support and encourage the starting place for the next review, particularly in the light of likely changes in national legislation, to start in a better place than the current plan has done.
Okay, thank you. Do you think, Mr. Burton, this has something to do with we heard from Ms. Butler earlier about the intention of the council to have an online plan at the time of the pandemic? Would it be fair to say there is a view here between a traditional format of a plan in written form with content page and perhaps the approach that the council has taken. And I will ask Ms Butler in a moment in terms of that content page, because I think it might have been the intention, the different sections, to be able to then obviously navigate through those different sections. But just your view on that, please.
Well, we certainly welcome the direction of travel, and my ears picked up at the idea of a digital map. GIS system is, crying out for a GIS system in Merton. The implementation of the kind of digital approach which will allow you to access the plan in a number of different ways, depending on where you're coming from, is absolutely the right aspiration. The evidence we've seen to date is that's unlikely to be what we will necessarily get. And that's not about just providing, as it were, chapters in PDFs on tiles on a page. So the plan does need to be able to be accessed in different ways. It also needs to be able to hang together in a coherent way. And that's been what's been lacking to date. So yes, it's welcome that that's a direction which the council would like to go. Merton, in other respects, and I think it would acknowledge that this is not in the fast lane, let's put it that way, in the digitisation of either planning or more generally local government services. There are plenty of precedents elsewhere which it would be good to see it drawing on, but I don't think that gets around some of the basics, like knowing what the figures are, not having a title, having some page numbers, not having a chapter 8, and having a contents page.
Thank you. And Ms Butler, just to kind of wrap up, just in terms of how these presentational and other issues raised might be addressed via modifications, please. Contents page is something that seems to be coming up quite a bit. And was it the intention you'd be able to legibly navigate from an opening page through different chapter sections? Is that almost like your online contents page then, with the links through? Is that your intention?
Yes. Yes, it was our intention, and it's also picking up on issues that local plans tend to be quite large, however succinct we make them, and downloading PDFs, especially if people are using smaller devices like phones, can be an issue. So when by necessity everything moved to a digital phase, as set out in our response to your second letter, so that's LBMO2, you will see the websites laid out in sections to help people navigate by chapter, creating the contents page like that. We accept definitely some of the points that Mr. Burton raises, and we will prepare a contents page. The lack of chapter 8 is entirely my fault, and we flagged that at regulation 19 stage, realizing that we just produced a document that's jumped from chapter 7 to chapter 9. We haven't chosen to change that at this stage because it would necessitate all the other policies for half the plan and all the paragraph numbers renumbering themselves. But we do intend to fix that should we get to a final plan stage. One point I'd just like to pick up on in Mr. Burton's statement, he mentioned employment land and retail evidence dating from 2010 and 2008. It's important to note that the evidence that we've prepared and submitted does not include the 2008 and 2010 evidence, and that while that's still available on the council's website, it's not something that we have submitted as part of the evidence used to produce the local plan.
Yeah, thanks, Ms. Butler. And we're going to be discussing town centres and employment more generally later in the course of these hearing sessions. Mr. Burton, I've heard what you've said about the drafting of the policies. Obviously, that's something that as the hearings go on, we'll get into in more detail. So I wouldn't anticipate a great deal of work, particularly on that at this stage, Ms. Butler, apart from where we discuss policies during the course of this 2 weeks. But it might be it may well be useful to have something before stage 2 that we can look at in terms of what the format of the final format of the plan might be, just to give us some comfort in terms of that distinction between policies and supporting text. And also, I think it's a bit chicken and eggish, isn't it? Because we've got to, there might be more modifications we've got to do. So it wouldn't be possible to do a contents page, I suppose, until we've finished that process, you know, and go out to consultations on the mods. But just some kind of thinking about what that plan would look like when we, you know, when you do go out to consult on main modifications, would be useful, particularly for that stage 2 set of hearings.
Just a minor point, but I think I think maybe have to reach a conclusion on this issue of a contents page, because as you've already alluded to, you have a home screen for your local plan, if adopted, and there would presumably when you then navigate through there. So I think there maybe needs to be a little bit of thought about how navigable that is, and how it directs users of the website to the different sections, maybe as opposed to a kind of traditional contents page, because I think you've already gone with the approach of having the different tiles, which in effect is would appear to be a contents page relevant to the chapters of your plan, 8 aside. But I think there does need to be some thought about that initial. We heard from Mr. Burton about issues of, you know, navigating the plan, people not necessarily being comfortable with how to get around the plan and find things. So I think that home screen is very important. You could bear that in mind, obviously, when you're looking at that ahead of stage 2. Okay, I want to move on a little bit now to discuss about the vision, the positive vision, and Mr. Byrne, I'd like to ask you, we'll discuss these matters in more detail in subsequent sessions, open space, green infrastructure at stage 2. But in terms of the visions and objectives, what are the key concerns here? And I'll just say broadly, you refer to not being positively prepared in terms of green spaces and biodiversity assets. Now, if you could just outline those key concerns and how they could be remedied at this stage. I think just in saying that, concerns about tall buildings would be better deferred to matter 13 next week. So if we just stick to those positive preparation, visions and objectives, outline your key concerns, please, and what could be done.
And if I can wear my other hat for a response.
Yes, I'm sorry, I probably should have addressed you in that context.
So as Mitcham Cricket Green Community and Heritage, I mean, I think in the terms that you've asked the question, I think the 2 things we would highlight are the absence from the spatial provision as submitted of references to protecting and enhancing Merton's green spaces and wildlife. And we acknowledge and welcome the proposed main modification that's come from the council. Although it does feel a bit, you know, of an afterthought, the very fact that actually in the opening comments that we had from the council, the importance of the green spaces were reflected, but actually they're not in the spatial vision until this very late stage in the process. Doesn't sort of build complete confidence that it's written through the plan like a stick of rock. The other is the, I suppose, the ability to deliver on the spatial vision within the plan period, which again is the kind of point of the spatial vision. It's meant to be able to be delivered. And we lack sort of the confidence that things like addressing the sort of east and west of the boroughs disparities, which is a very clearly expressed council priority, you know, is actually going to be addressed through the policies and the plans. I think there's a deliverability question. If I can just change hats, so in my role on the Wandle Valley Forum, Our concerns with the spatial vision are the absence of green spaces, landscape, biodiversity, and we would add to that the blue infrastructure of the borough, as well as its green infrastructure. The absence of the Wandle Valley as a sort of defining characteristic, which is recognised and acknowledged in the document, including clarification that the Wandle Valley includes Norby Brook and River Graveney, not just the channel of the Wandle. And we believe that a more appropriate boundary for the Wandle Valley Regional Park should be included in the documentation that's provided, and that should be part of the whatever we end up calling it, the spatial, the geographical expression on a map of the spatial vision of the plan.
Thank you, Mr. Burton. Ms. Butler.
If I could take the point about the Wandle Valley Regional Park first, as sets out in, or as rather summarised in our response to the Wandle Valley Forum's representation at Regulation 19, which is in Schedule OD7, we have used the Wandle Valley Regional Park boundary defined by the Wandle Valley Regional Park and as set in the All London Green Grid. I think there may be a difference of opinion between ourselves and the Wandle Valley Forum as to what the All London Green Grid says. We believe that the brown hatched area describes the industrial parts of the Wandle Valley, but it's clear to us that it does not define the Wandle Valley Regional Park boundary. So we've used the boundary as defined by the organisation. On the issues of the spatial vision, as summarised in our response to matter 2, question 3, and in the schedule of main modifications LBM03 modification 1.2, we propose adding a sentence to recognise that green spaces and biodiversity weren't adequately represented before.
Just before we move on, Mr. Burton, I'll give you the opportunity to just come back on this boundary point.
Yeah, so I've got a third hat because I am also actually at the moment the lead trustee of the Wandle Valley Regional Park Trust, which I think is the organisation that you're referencing, as it were, as providing the definition of the boundary. And the Regional Park Trust doesn't define the Wandle Valley Regional Park in terms of lines on maps around green spaces. But by definition, there's important parts of the river that aren't in green spaces. It's a catchment-based approach, which is more accurately reflected by the All London Green Grid as provided on the in the evidence that's been presented by Wandle Valley Forum.
Can you just explain to me, Mr. Burton, just the significance of that? Ms. Butler said that we've taken a boundary, an established boundary, it would appear to be, but you're saying, well, in effect, it should be a wider catchment area.
Well, it's clearly significant for the purposes of applying the policies that relate to the Wandle Valley and the Wandle Valley Regional Park within the plan. Merton's plan is welcome within the 4 local plans that are relevant to the Wandle Valley for the definition of the buffer around it, and we welcome that, and clearly the definition of the boundary of the regional park is an important part of the application of that policy. And it's important to simply acknowledge the point that the Wandle Valley Regional Park is not just green spaces. It is a continuous park, which from the source in Croydon or Sutton through to the Thames in Wandsworth.
Ms. Waller, did you want to make any final comments on that?
Yeah, I think that the actual detailed boundary is something that we'll discuss further in stage 2 when we come on to discuss green infrastructure in open spaces and blue infrastructure in in more detail at that point, but it's useful to have that point flagged now.
Okay, so just moving on. Ms. Butler, just in terms of monitoring, can you explain how you arrived at the key indicators for monitoring, please? I know, for example, monitoring of heritage was not included in monitoring framework. Why is that? The central plank of the strategy relates to effects on designated heritage assets from tall buildings. And there are some concerns regarding the evidence base. If you could just kind of explain those key indicators and whether any modifications would be proposed to those, please.
As set out in our response to matter 2, issue 3, question 4, with the addition of our proposed main modification 19.1, we believe that the plan will be capable of being monitored through the specific indicators. The key indicators were derived from the sustainability appraisal and the scoping reports, and they were contained within those. They have been adapted, picking up on representations received at various consultation stages to ensure that heritage assets are monitored in their fullest sense. So now, for example, the proposed indicators on heritage assets, the thematic area looks at the historic and built environment, including sites, features, landscape, and areas of historical, architectural, archaeological, and cultural interest.
Thank you. I'll ask your view in a moment, Mr. Burton, if you have any, but what about any actions such as plan review or other activity that might be triggered by monitoring? And what would be the triggers for such action? And this goes to the effectiveness of the plan and review activity as described in paragraph 33 of the framework.
The schedule of main modification, the main modification 19.1 contains, one second. Contains the list of indicator, let me just, contains a table, local plan monitoring framework with the thematic area, monitoring indicator, and targets. Usually these targets are recorded every year in the Council's authority monitoring report, and targets are considered over a 3-year cycle to see if matters have been met. This 3-year cycle is also reflected in national policy, for example, on the housing delivery test.
So just generally in terms of the table that's in the main modification, we've got the, so there's 3 columns, effectively thematic area, monitoring indicator, and target, if applicable. But I suppose what Inspector Aston was trying to tease out here is, if that target's not met, what's the action? it might be plan review, it might be compulsory purchase orders are considered, or those kind of actions. It might be an SPDs needed for a particular area, and then what will be the trigger for any action in that respect? So is it a significant undershoot of that target? Is it just a slight undershoot of it? And what's the trigger, and what actions would be triggered as a result of that? I think that's something that might assist the effectiveness of it, of the monitoring more generally.
Thank you, Inspector. From the way you phrased that, I think it's something the council should go away and look at, because it's clearly not as clear as we think it is, and provide not just the 3-year trigger, but what potential actions might be taken.
Yeah, I mean, I totally take your point that the AMR will contain that information, but it's just how does the plan articulate and work together with the AMR, thinking about how effective its policies are and how the monitoring helps with that. I think there's just perhaps a bit missing there. But if you could think about that, in terms of the finalised wording of this modification.
Mr. Burton, do you have any comments to make on the monitoring that we've just discussed?
Yes, we've made some we've provided some detailed feedback on the monitoring, which I think Tara mentioned. It draws on the sustainability appraisal, the appendix there, which has been transferred into the document. We don't think that a number of the, what are you calling them, monitoring indicators are sufficient or fit for purpose in addressing the thematic area and the sort of objective of the plan. And if it would be helpful for me to draw some examples, the Heritage at Risk Register, important though it is and valuable though it is a very limited appreciation of the heritage assets of an area. And indeed, we have direct experience of an asset on the Heritage at Risk Register. For about the last decade or so, we've been trying to get Merton Council to take action to get it off the Heritage at Risk Register. And we've been unable to secure the level of action that's required. So I think how meaningful some of these are when action doesn't flow is for debate. We don't think that simply monitoring the number of planning permissions, given permission, is sufficient to address whether the plan is making best and most efficient use of land to support sustainable patterns and forms of development. We do not understand, other than the fact that Merton Council might be the promoter of them, why educational establishments are excluded from the monitoring of the loss of open space to development. They don't get a free pass, and there's significant debate and discussion to be had about educational establishments on open space. We don't see that the workings of the design review panel are sufficient to deliver what's going to be an increasing focus of planning policy around quality of design. We also have additional reservations about the quality of the design review arrangements in Merton, although they are being strengthened. And we believe that there are effective monitoring tools available on tree canopy, tree canopy being the most obvious one, which could be deployed on a more systematic basis. They're just examples of where we believe the monitoring framework can be strengthened to deliver on the ambitions of the plan.
Ms. Butler, having heard that from Mr. Burton, is there anything you wanted to add to what you said previously?
Just to draw Inspector's attention to document OD6, which is the schedule of representations at Regulation 19, which sets out what Mr. Burton just said and the Council's response on those issues, round about page 41.
Okay, thank you. I just briefly, Mr. Burton, I just want to come back to cover a point you made earlier. You talked about the disparities between different parts of the borough. And I just wanted to ask, do you have a view as to how those could be monitored?
As a starting point, I think having a clear reporting mechanism on the geography of the indicators that are being used would be helpful. So when you're looking at whatever tracking or monitoring framework is being provided, that it speaks to you on that point. I think the council is clear what it thinks the west and the east of the borough are. So I think that's, whether wards are always the best building block for that, I'm not entirely sure, but that may be the best that we've got for these purposes. So I would start there. So we have a tracking mechanism, not just for Merton and not just on a ward basis, but on that kind of meta geography, if I can call it that, of the borough. I don't think this is about any new or special monitoring data. I think the data is whatever the data is that's being used. I think it's understanding that data at that geographical level. So I don't think we're, other than the broader point I was making about that there is more data that could be being used and more sources of information that could be used and more refined information that could be being used. But that would apply and benefit the whole borough. I think it's how it's reported if we're to look at the west-east disparity.
Do you have any thoughts on that point as well?
Yes, just to say the council publishes an authority monitoring reports, and we've submitted some, well, at least the most recent one with the local plan submission in December. The website contains our authority monitoring reports going back to 2004. Appreciating that the data is the data, things are monitored in different geographies. For example, with planning applications, it is on individual site level, and we are able to produce that kind of data by ward or by half the borough or by 400-meter radius, however it's required. That's reflected in, for example, the most recent authority monitoring report, which contains a map looking forward with the housing trajectory showing where new housing sites are. On the illustration of other data, as Mr. Burton alluded to, it really depends on the data. Census data, we can go down to super output area. Other issues are both site specific and borough average. If we're using employment data, we can take that at relatively small geographies, but sometimes it's averaged across the borough, which isn't very helpful for anyone. But just to emphasize that we do look at different geographies when we're displaying data, and we believe that the council's authority monitoring report does illustrate how we display that.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the monitoring table again in the proposed main modification. So there are a lot of indicators there that would be relevant to thinking about what these disparities between the east and western parts of the borough are, and it's just a question of whether that could be articulated when you're monitoring the plan. So there's things like number of people unemployed, number of new jobs created, number of 16, I'm just picking up economic indicators here, number of 16 to 24-year-olds in training or apprenticeship or work programs. Then there's other things on crime and those kind, and health and other sorts of things like that. So it's just, I suppose it's thinking about, it's part of the vision and objectives of the plan, isn't it? This to sort of to reduce the inequalities between those two areas. It's just a question of how that's monitored, and whether you want to give some thought to that in when we're coming to look towards this, to finalising the monitoring table. We've heard what what Mr. Burton has said generally about some of the monitoring indicators, and obviously there's a lot of them to look through there, and I don't suggest that we do it right now, but that's something that Inspector Aston and I will go away and think about when we come to finalise the main modification table on this. We may well pick up again in stage 2, but we've taken your point on that, Mr. Burton, so thank you for that. So I'll just pass back over to Inspector Aston now.
Thank you, Inspector Ford. Ms. Fuller, just the final. Oh, sorry, Mr. Burton.
So just apologies. Could I just make a final point? I know you don't want to get into the detail, but I think it is a relevant one given where national policy is going. On biodiversity, it is odd that the monitoring around open spaces references biodiversity net gain, but the monitoring on biodiversity doesn't reference biodiversity net gain.
That's a fairly straightforward point. We need to, thank you, Mr. Burton. Just finally, Ms. Butler, just about the publication ahead of the revised MPPF. It's a fairly straightforward question. Have the implications been assessed and the plan updated accordingly? And would proposed modifications ensure the latest version is reflected?
Yes, as set out in our response to matter 2, issue 4, question 1, we did consider the implications of the new MPPF. Unfortunately, in drafting the employment chapter, I think still referred to the old one, but the implications were considered. We've proposed a main modification to address the issues in that chapter. Main modification 2.1.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Burton, did you have anything? Okay, that brings to the close of this particular hearing session. But before I do, is everyone satisfied that they've said what they wanted to in relation to this matter at this stage? Is there any final comments, Ms. Butler, that you wanted to add? What I propose to do, we are a little bit early. It is just before 10 to. Yeah, I was going to propose not to bring the afternoon session forward for obvious reasons, but that would just have a slightly longer break. Okay, so if there isn't anything else, this particular session is now closed. Thank you.